It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name's Les Rowe. I'm the President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Victoria, and we are this evening very pleased to be working with the School of International Relations in putting together this evening's program on the United Nations and Australia's bid for the Security Council. In case any of you don't know about this AIIA, you'll find a lot of information out the door there, and we would welcome you as members. We're 80 years old. We've been trying to spread information about international relations and to encourage debate and discussion in a non-partisan way for that whole period. I will not in any way speak on behalf of the Institute because we don't have Institute positions on things. But I've been given 6 seconds, by the way, to introduce this evening's program, but when you've got the mic, they can't take it away from you. And so I'll just give a little bit of background. I was a member of the United Nations, the Australian delegation to the United Nations from 82 to 86. I was a member of the team that managed to win a seat on the Security Council in 1985-86, and I served on the Security Council delegation for 1 year at that time. Now, our panel has been asked to address a number of questions. And the questions are, does Australia deserve a seat on the Council? Undoubtedly. If elected to the Council, who or what would Australia represent, defend the interests of and promote? Australia would represent itself. It would represent decent values. It would represent commitment to multilateralism and commitment to basic decency. Why would a country like Australia want a seat on the Council? Because we're a member in excellent standing in the United Nations. We've been a strong supporter of multilateralism. We've been a strong supporter of the UN and its agencies, and it's time. On balance, is a seat on the Council on Australia's national interest? Absolutely. In the final 6 months leading up to the vote, what should Australia do and how should it go to get elected? It should do what it's been doing. It shouldn't go out there and try and do handstands. How significant has the removal of Kevin Rudd from Cabinet been for Australia's chances of election to the Council? I suggest you ask Mr. Carr that. But my own feeling is it's a government commitment, and the commitment that's been made will not change. Why should developing countries support Australia's bid for a seat? Because we have been strong supporters of the UN's role in development assistance. We've been strong supporters of developing country interests. We are in the Pacific. We know more about the Pacific than anybody else, and that's a large block of members whose concerns we take serious note of and will promote. We're also a member of the Commonwealth and I'm a member of lots of other multilateral groups which deal with developing countries. In what sense, if any, can Australia represent the interests of the region? Well, we don't represent anybody's interests except ourselves and the principles we stand for, but we will be a voice, an open voice. The door will always be open for countries of our region. That's it. Now, if you feel that you've got enough out of tonight and you want to race off and get to the bar, I think Robyn Eckersley will have something to say about that, but it's my great pleasure to introduce Robyn Eckersley, Professor Eckersley, who will moderate this evening's function. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Les, and it's great to be working with the Australian Institute of International Affairs in this event. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and families. A very warm welcome to our public-spirited audience, including the high school students that have come out here on a Thursday evening. This event is part of the Australia's Role in the World series, which is a partnership initiative between the University of Melbourne, the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and UN Youth Australia. And it's aiming to promote debate on global issues and Australia's role in international affairs. And you can find their website just by Googling Australia's Role in the World. Now, I should mention that the United Nations Association of Australia is running a campaign, a public one, to support this bid. And we have amongst our panellists the current president and immediate past president of that organisation. So I'll start by introducing the current president, who is the Honourable Robert Hill, Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. He's a graduate of that particular university. He's known nationally and locally and internationally, of course, for his role working in the UN and as a former Australian federal politician. He was, prior to that, a barrister and solicitor, but he's also had a very long political career during which he served as Defence Minister, Leader of the Government in the Senate, Minister for the Environment and Heritage. And since then, he worked as the permanent representative to the United Nations between 2006 and 2009. He's an adjunct professor in sustainability with the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Melissa Conley-Tyler is the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs since 2008. She's a lawyer and a specialist in conflict resolution, including negotiation, mediation, and peace education. She was previously the Program Manager of the International Conflict Resolution Centre here at the University of Melbourne and a Senior Fellow at the Melbourne Law School. She's got quite an international profile in conflict resolution, which includes membership of the UN Expert Working Group on Online Dispute Resolution, and she's on the editorial board of the Conflict Resolution Quarterly. She's run online dispute resolutions forums, and she's worked for more than 10 years in community organisations in Australia, South Africa and the USA. Andrew Hewett is the Executive Director of Oxfam Australia, one of Australia's largest and leading aid organisations. He's consistently in the public spotlight advocating for the world's poor. He's an influential voice, particularly in aid policy. He was the co-chair of Make Poverty History, which is the largest anti-poverty movement in Australia and leads more than 60 aid agencies, community groups and organisations that form this coalition. He's also Vice President of the Executive Committee of the Australian Council for International Development, which is the peak council of overseas development agencies, and he represents this sector in Australia. He's been ED of Oxfam since 2001. And finally, Professor John Langmore, who is a Professorial Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences. He worked for a long time in Papua New Guinea as a public servant and university lecturer, and he led the preparation for their first national plan. Between 76 and 84, he was an economic advisor to the Australian Labor Party and proposed the negotiation of the Accord. No small feat. In 1984, he was elected to the House of Representatives and was later re-elected 4 times. He chaired the committee which planned the first comprehensive committee system for the House of Representatives. He retired from Parliament in 1996 and became director of the UN Division for Social Policy and Development in New York for 5 years, and then worked as a rep for the International Labour Organization for a further 2 years. He was responsible for the organisation of the 24th General Session of the General Assembly, which was the first world conference to agree on the global target for halving serious poverty in 2015. Professor Langmore teaches a graduate subject on the United Nations in our Master of International Relations course, and he's published extensively, and we don't have time to list them. Okay, we're going to get down to it very soon, folks, but for the benefit of some of you who may not have any background knowledge on the Security Council, I'm going to spend just 1 or 2 minutes filling you in, and then we're going to cut to the chase. Now, as you all probably know, the United Nations Security Council was established after the Second World War, and its primary purpose is to promote international peace and security. It's a very powerful organisation that has considerable discretion to decide how to do that under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. It can determine whether to use force in maintaining peace or preventing conflict. It can decide whether to impose sanctions. It can admonish states. It can do all sorts of things. It's a very powerful body. And since the end of the Cold War, it's become a little more adventurous. It doesn't only dispatch peacekeeping troops as neutral keepers of the peace, it has also taken upon itself to authorise the use of force for humanitarian intervention to prevent mass atrocities. Last year, we looked at this in the debate on the intervention in Libya in the course of our Q&A last year on international responses to democratisation in the Arab world. Now, the Security Council has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent. You probably can guess which ones they are: the US, Russia, the UK, France and China. but it also has 10 non-permanent members. Now, these are elected by secret ballot in the United Nations General Assembly. The presidency of the Security Council is a position that rotates on a monthly basis among the members, so even non-permanent members can get to be president. Australia had the honour of serving as the first president in 1946 and last served in 1985 as president with Richard Woolcott. It's been on the council 4 times. We know you need 9 votes on the Security Council to pass a resolution, subject of course to a veto by one of the permanent 5 members. So sometimes a non-permanent member can have a swing vote. Now, the United Nations Charter lays down the selection for members of the Security Council, and basically they look at your contribution to the maintenance of international peace and security and the other purposes of the UN system, and they're also keen to ensure equitable geographic representation. The next election for a seat that's relevant to Australia at least takes place in October this year for a 2-year non-permanent seat for the period 2013 to 2014. Australia is in the United Nations regional grouping called Western Europe and Other, or WEOG, which comprises 28 states. The group has 2 seats. At the moment, they're occupied by Germany and Portugal. Now, in 2008, the former Prime Minister, that was an interesting slip, Foreign Minister, Kevin Rudd, announced Australia's bid for a seat as a non-permanent member on the Council. We're going to have to garner 2/3 of the vote of the United Nations General Assembly to win that seat. That's 128 votes out of 193. It's been more than a quarter of a century since we sat, as it were. As Rudd said, it's been a long time between drinks. And since then, the world has changed quite a lot, and I think Australia has too. So tonight, we're going to ask the question, does Australia deserve a seat on the Council? And I'm going to start by asking each of the panellists their response to this simple question. We're then going to have some follow-up questions amongst us, and after about 30 minutes, we will open up to the audience for questions, and we'll finish up at 7:45. So Robert Hill, I'm going to ask you first. In your view, does Australia deserve a seat?
Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank to the University of Melbourne and the Australian Institute for International Affairs, and pleased to contribute to discussion on international affairs anywhere, anytime. Having said that, I'm not actually comfortable with the question because it makes it sound as if being on the Council is a reward. Certainly there is a certain amount of prestige attached to it, and you know, many a foreign minister and prime minister or a head of state has rather liked to sit in the president's chair, which they get to do for a month on a rotational basis. But I think it's the wrong way to look at the issue. I think the issue, for me, Australia should aspire to serve on the Security Council because of what it can contribute. So I guess what justifies me saying that in terms of what we have contributed, as Les really said, since the founding of the United Nations, Australia has been a primary activist. Practically every peacekeeping mission that the UN has dispatched, Australia has been part of it. On peace and security, we are always there, and basically we can look to a record of major contribution and major success. Just think of our own region. It's not always under the auspices of the UN. The Ramsey intervention in the Solomon Islands, the contribution to the conflict in Bougainville, our long contribution under different guises in Timor-Leste, and so I can go on. And it is a contribution that is well appreciated globally. So even though I'm uncomfortable with the question and the way you phrase it, they are the reasons why I think we're a very legitimate candidate and why I think that 2/3 of the international community, 2/3 of the member states, as reflecting the international community, would rather like to see us serve.
Thank you. Melissa, what's your take on the question?
Well, I will say I love the sophistication of the question because there's so much in that word deserve. Are we a morally deserving country? Is it will we do a good job? As Robert said, we deserve to be there because we will contribute. Is it that we represent a particular constituency, small and middle powers, which really deserve to be heard, or even the other bit of Western Europe and other that doesn't get much of a go when you come down to it? Is it that we ran a really good bid, and because we've run a good bid from behind, from a later starting position than our competitors, we deserve to get the chance? So I think there's all sorts of ways we can see that. At the same time, I think I would agree that this concept of deserve doesn't necessarily fit so well with the Security Council as what is so much a political institution. We're not going to get a Guernsey just because we're nice or we deserve it or we ran well. It's very much a process of rhetorical persuasion, coming up with a good image, good reputation and a good narrative that's going to capture the numbers for us. I think there's also a slight irony in talking about the Security Council in this sense of fairness. The Security Council, as I say, is a political institution. It hasn't been set up with fairness in mind. It's very much controlled by the Permanent Five, who have so much say in the agenda and the topics. It's very difficult sometimes for the elected 10 to really have much impact in some ways. So I think there is some irony in thinking that fairness is the main way that will be chosen.
Okay, John, what's your take?
I think the answer is yes, but we're not as deserving as we ought to be. Yes, because it's a representative body and we're the 15th largest or so economy in the world. It's a long time since we've been a member. We are increasing our aid. We have a long record of commitment to the UN system. We were very actively involved at the beginning, and most governments until the last 15 years have been entirely and fully supportive. But during the last 15 years, our record is much more uneven. We supported America in acting illegally in invading Iraq. We have an uneven record of treatment of asylum seekers. We don't abide by our treaty obligations, and certainly not those of the Universal Declaration. We've been very uneven in our treatment of Indigenous people, and numbers of countries are very concerned about that. Our aid is still low, though it's increasing. So there are a number of reasons why our record is not nearly as good as it ought to be. But during the last 3 or 4 years, the record has improved. As Robert rightly said, we've continued to be very active in peacekeeping, and we have attempted in various ways to renew our commitment. And I think that intention will be clear to a lot of delegates. So I think we have to recognise that with humility, we probably deserve to be elected.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Well, maybe the first question is whether, as part of Australia's foreign policy objectives, we should be standing for the Security Council. So if I go to that question first, and I think it's an entirely legitimate part of Australian foreign policy to be pursuing an election for the Security Council. Once every 30 years is not particularly excessive level of ambition, so I think it's quite appropriate. And given Australia's role as a medium-level power, our investment in multilateralism, standing for the Security Council flows from that sort of investment. Then to move to the question about whether Australia deserves it, and I take particularly Melissa's point, it's an election, it's not going to be a fair process, it's actually not a fair or overly democratic institution, so it's a question of whether Australia can make a contribution. And I think there the judgment is probably it's a qualified yes, and for probably similar reasons for what John was suggesting. We do have a good record as a supporter of multilateralism over many years, going back to Doc Everett being the first president of the General Assembly. And if you read Frank Morehouse, even the predecessor organisation to the UN, the League of Nations. We have that record of involvement in peacekeeping operations. On more contemporary political issues, the engagement in the arms trade treaty negotiations, Australia's played a key role there. But the qualifications come. And the qualifications are around a number of things which John has already touched upon, where Australia's record is not so satisfactory. The invasion of Iraq is one example where we deliberately stood outside multilateral organs and multilateral forums. Our approach to asylum seekers, our approach to Indigenous peoples really do raise a significant question mark. And then there's our record on overseas aid. Admittedly, it's improved considerably, but this is where we start to get to the realpolitik of the other two candidates, Finland and Luxembourg. Luxembourg it spends 0.97% of its gross national income on aid. Australia currently has got it up to a relatively high level for Australia, 0.35. Finland is also got a level of aid spending which is significantly greater than Australia's. So on some of the key criteria, we could do better and we could be a much more worthy candidate, but we've got a good track record in other areas. So it's a bit of a mixed picture. It's like the curate's egg.
Okay, well, it sounds like we're almost in furious agreement about the question, yes, we ought to have a go. So I'm going to have to play the devil's advocate a little bit here. I'll start by asking you again, Robert Hill. Australia's up against Luxembourg and Finland. Finland's campaign is called Credible, Creative and Caring. Luxembourg's campaign is called Commitment, Contribution and Responsibility. And our campaign is called Making a Difference for the Small and Medium Countries of the World. Do you think this is a credible bid? And how might Australia make a difference for the small and for the little people?
Firstly, can I say I didn't agree with everything John said.
Good.
And if we want to have a debate on Iraq, we'll have a debate on Iraq. There are apparently a lot of countries that have acted illegally. The little countries, I guess, I didn't design the campaign slogan, and if we get beaten, then you'll have two extra European Union states, small European states on the Security Council. And she said it's only 15. It's already got France and United Kingdom, and from the East European, there's likely to be another European Union. So there's likely to be 5 European Union states out of 15 in a body of 293. And I don't think that's reflective of the geopolitical world. Australia, on the other hand, is at the other end of the world. We are surrounded by developing countries. And whilst I wouldn't say, for example, that we represent these small island states, they wouldn't want to say we represented them. Nevertheless, we do work very closely with them, and I think may well listen to their perspective and be more willing to put it than some European states. So I do think it's important, and it is important also when we talk about the aid debate and so forth, to remember, as you said in your introduction, that the Security Council is about international peace and security. That's its principal charge, to end the scourge of war, etc. So when you look at Australia's place in the world with in that role, and you add to our geographical reality at the other end from the traditional powers and surrounded by developing countries both in Asia and in the Pacific, I can see how, I think in that slogan they're trying to say we reflect a different part of the world than the part that traditionally has held power on the Security Council.
So under WEOG, they're literally representing the other.
Well, there's not many others,
Yeah.
and we're a bit interested in getting out of WEOG and getting into the Asian group, which is a little more logical, and the Asians didn't want us because we were more competition. So that's how things work in the UN. So we're stuck in WEOG, but the OGs, the Canadas and us in New Zealand and that, nevertheless are entitled to have a voice from time to time. And just remember, Canada got beaten last year by Portugal, by a European state. So it's another reason why I think perhaps it's time this time.
John, you've written opinion pieces talking about Australia's civic duty to stand, but not everyone thinks we should want a seat. For example, Raoul Heinrich, in a scathing attack on Australia's bid in an Age op-ed back in February, put it in those terms and said that Australia would be constantly forced to choose between the US on the one hand and China on the other. So the question is, which of those superpowers, John, do you think we're going to most disappoint? And why would we put ourselves in that position?
I would like to think we'd most disappoint the United States, but I think that's most unlikely. And I think that's a problem in relation to the previous question. Both parties in Australia are more concerned about their relations with the United States than with any other country. And they tend to do mostly what the US wants. Now, I think running for the Security Council is encouraging us to think a bit more independently. I think it's very good for us to become more aware of attitudes and interests and concerns in the developing world, where at the UN we haven't been particularly engaged with that, not nearly as much as we should be. The central thing about the Security Council, and I carry around my copy of the Charter, is that it has the central responsibility for peace and security, and that's perhaps the most important goal of international relations, really. And for us not to want to be to take an opportunity to be part of the discussions about peace and security just sounds extraordinary. It's a really amazing thing. I don't think there's any other country in the world where some people have argued seriously that we shouldn't run. I mean, was there anyone in Australia who wasn't glad that we got appointed to the G20? And that's about economic policy. Why wouldn't we want to be a member of the international body that has responsibility for attempting peaceful conflict resolution or responding to conflict when it occurs? I mean, it would be bizarre if we didn't take that opportunity when it's available to us.
Okay, well, Melissa, Gareth Evans, Kevin Rudd and now Bob Carr have said a lot about Australia as a creative middle power and practising creative middle power diplomacy. Could you enlighten the audience as to what on earth creative middle power diplomacy actually means, and what would be our best examples of that?
I think this follows on very well from the previous question. The idea of creative middle power diplomacy is saying, well, essentially descriptively, we are neither a great power that can enforce our will on the world and make the world exactly the way we wish it to be, neither at the same time we're entirely inconsequential power. We are in the top 15 economies in the world, the top 15 defence force in the world. We are a major aid spender, and if we keep going the way that we are looking at going, we'll be well into the top 10 of aid spenders. So we're not inconsequential, we can play a role. The question is always, what substance do we give to that? So very often when Australia is talking about creative middle power diplomacy, it's about having a seat at the table. And something like G20 is a great example where we did get the seat at the table. And I think if former Prime Minister Rudd was talking about his greatest achievements, he would put G20 and our long-term seat at the table as one of those highest achievements. Your question then becomes, what do you do with it? You know, you've got the seat at the table, what's the next step? If you look at something like G20, I think we have played a very positive role in a number of areas. They're not necessarily front page news areas, but they're areas where we have played a constructive role, particularly mediating between different groups in the international system. So the example I'd look at is something like IMF quota reform. So the International Monetary Fund, which is one of the mainstays of the global financial system, has a quota system which is pretty much as archaic as the UN Security Council and its idea of the distribution of power. And it says that it, until recently, would give a country like Belgium potentially almost as many votes as somewhere like China or India. Okay, so it's definitely a relic of older systems. And with the assistance of South Africa, Australia worked to change that, to negotiate something that both the older powers who were advantaged by the system and the newer emerging powers who did not like the system were able to agree with. So I think there's that possibility. The query, and I know I'm going on a little long, but I did want to respond to John's comments. I think there's a lot in this idea of us being exposed on the Security Council. Right now, in Australia's history, we've got something quite new for us. If you see us the way that Richard Rigby talks about us, as at existing during the high point of British imperialism, we've had a 200 years where, quite contrary to most of human history, Asia has not had the sort of strength that its population has usually meant that it has in the world system. That's changing. We're coming back to what you would call the sort of the historical average, which is a very strong Asia. It's new for us, it's difficult for us, because we wish, as Raoul puts very well, we wish to have our very strong security relationship with the US and our wonderful economic relationship with China forever. No choices, nothing difficult, all working perfectly. And the have our cake and eat it too forever strategy is working fine at the moment, but it may not always work. Your danger is that if Security Council issues become difficult and force us to make difficult choices, it might be hard for us. Now, that's not saying we should never be there. It might be saying that this particular moment, when we're still feeling our way to how to deal with those issues, might not be the time to expose ourselves. If it's going to be a crisis for Korean Peninsula or South China Seas or India-Pakistan, do we actually want to have to decide? So I think there is something in the argument, and it's not an argument about never being on the Security Council. It's about, is now the best time?
Okay, Andrew, Bob McMullen has been on a charm offensive in Africa because there are 50 more votes to be had. And we've set up a mission in Addis Ababa, which is the home of the African Union. And there's some that might say this just all looks a little bit cynical. We've upped our aid budget, and so all of this is wooing those 54 African votes. So since you speak for developing countries, how do you think they see it? How do you think African states see this? Is it merely a cynical move, or do they welcome this increased attention from Australia?
Well, I don't speak for developing countries. Right. Make that clear. I think it's a good move, and I think it's a long overdue move. I think we over in the eastern seaboard of Australia tend to forget Australia also looks towards Africa, and the Indian Ocean is an ocean we border as much as the Pacific Ocean. I think Australia's neglect of Africa has been one of the long-standing sore problems with both our foreign policy and with our development policy. Yes, the aid program has increased, and yes, the proportion of the aid program going towards Africa has increased, but it's still only about 5% of the overall aid program. We're not talking big dollars. I think the level of diplomatic representation in Africa is still lamentably low. I'm glad we're now finally getting a mission in Addis, but there are many other countries where Australia has commercial interests. There are something like 200 Australian mining companies operating throughout Africa, where there are commercial interests, where there are legitimate strategic interests, legitimate foreign policy interests. Australia should be more heavily engaged in Africa, not less. If it has a positive benefit byproduct, this increased engagement in Africa for the UN Security Council, well, so be it. I think it's going to last beyond October this year. And I will be doing my best to try to make sure it does last beyond October this year. Yes, there may be some who are cynical. There may be some who are saying, well, the way you've gone about the aid program, Australia's gone about the aid program, is to touch as many different countries as possible. But the actual engagement in Africa, as I say, long overdue and still under-resourced and still not receiving the priority it deserves.
Robyn, could I just say in relation to Melissa's point, with which I agreed, and that is that in relation to the US, and China. The more serious point is, could we play a useful role as an in-between country, and in trying to improve communication, in trying to mediate in a sense, and we're not as skillful as we ought to be, but it would be a challenge that we ought to try and attempt to fulfil, I think.
Robert, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I didn't agree with Melissa really in that this argument that because you are in an alliance, you therefore shouldn't aspire to serve on the Security Council. You go onto the Security Council with an identity. You don't discard your identity. In many ways, our alliances can be as much of an asset as, certainly more than an asset, I would argue, than a liability. And nobody expects you to be something other. And it's a great mistake politically and from a campaign perspective if you try to project yourself as something different to what you are. So nobody would have any illusions in that regard. They would know Australia is a principal ally of the United States, and we're not embarrassed by that, and that would be part of the background in which we serve.
Do you think we left our run too late? I mean, it was announced in 2008. Finland and Luxembourg were in the early 2000s, and with an election coming up, we don't have bipartisan support. It's not clear what sort of message that might send. Is a little bit of a hurried bid, perhaps?
Well, I don't think so. I've got to say that because I advised Rudd to stand. So, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's plenty of time, and there's an enormous amount of energy that's been put into the campaign, and just how much energy and time do you want to put into one particular foreign policy aspiration? Thought of it going on for 10 years or 20 years. Some of them are nominating now 20 years. 20-year campaign, I think, is getting ridiculous. We came in after the other two, it is true, but in the end that doesn't really count for much. Germany last year came in much later than Canada, and Canada, as I said, got beaten. Germany actually came top in the group, so that doesn't count for much. I think it's certainly a pity that there isn't a totally bipartisan approach to this campaign. The position of the coalition is said, yes, certainly we should aspire to be on the Security Council and we should serve from time to time, but they have difficulties with this particular timing. So, you know, we stood in 1995 and got beaten. Got beaten by Portugal and Sweden, and we could talk about that, but probably won't. Then we were standing again for the 2005, and John Howard, who was then putting a much greater emphasis on sort of regional diplomacy than multilateral in terms of the UN, didn't proceed with the contest. There was also a concern, we were a bit unpopular at that time over Iraq and some other things, how it would have worked out. A bit embarrassing to lose twice. And now we're standing again. As we've said, it's a long time since we last served on the Security Council, and if we hadn't have nominated on this occasion, the dates that they were talking about were well out, 2018 or something. And some said, well, we should stand then because at the moment nobody else is nominated. Well, every contest will be a difficult contest. I'm not saying this is an easy contest, but you won't get an easier one than you've got this time. So why wouldn't you be in it?
Well, let's look at costs then, John. I think so far the campaigns, there's about a $23 million budget for the campaign. And so, you know, the question is, are taxpayers getting value for this investment? But against that, though, we've actually run down our overseas missions. We're actually below the OECD average in terms of numbers of missions, and our diplomatic staff are underfunded. So are we investing enough in our diplomatic missions to do the sort of good in the world that we do have the potential to do?
2 points. One is that the campaign is costing relatively little. I mean, less than 30 million is not a lot, and mostly that's spent on increasing understanding about Australia or increasing our understanding about other countries, both of which are things that the diplomats should be doing all the time anyway. There are some special features of it, but all constructive ones. I don't see any problem with that at all. But in relation, the much more important question really about the level of funding of Australian diplomacy, it is now 5% lower than it was in 1995, 17 years ago. And this is absolutely absurd because the economy has grown by whatever it is, 40% or 50% in that time. Our international interests have grown in that time, and we've got fewer diplomats overseas than we had 17 years ago. It's absurd. And we have fewer overseas diplomats than any other member of the G20. And many of those are developing countries. So we are severely underfunding our diplomacy. And I think if everyone in this room understands that, it would be a very good thing. And I understand from the two previous ministers, Gareth Evans and Alexander Downer, that both of them tried hard to build it up. And in both cases, the Department of Finance cut it. And it seems that the Department of Finance has a set against the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that needs to be overcome. So we ought to launch a campaign.
Okay, I've got two quick questions, then we're going to open it up to you. Melissa, you're a specialist in conflict resolution. So what effect would Australia's support for Israel have on the Security Council dynamics, particularly in the hotbed that is the Middle East? I'm thinking Syria, I'm thinking Iran, I'm just thinking of Israel and Palestine. How do you think Australia's going to handle those sensitive issues?
It will be challenging, I'm sure. I think it will also be an issue in our campaign. And the support for Israel does make it difficult for us to win as many seats from Arab-led countries as we would wish. There was, for example, the discussion about whether to vote against or abstain on the recent resolution on PLO membership, Palestinian membership. So you have a lot of issues like that to try to manage. I think we're coming back to that whole issue of the difficulties that Australia might have if we are successful, and I will go a little bit more on that. The case study I would use would be something like South Africa, which had its first ever shot at the Security Council seat in 2007 to 8. So you've got to think back. This is the post-apartheid South Africa, the rainbow nation, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. People thought this was going to be wonderful. What a great thing to have South Africa on the council. And they spent their 2 years progressively disappointing everybody. Okay. And the reason is very simple. They were torn in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, Western countries thought they're going to support all of these human rights initiatives, they're going to care about climate change, they're going to see our way of seeing the world. But South Africa felt very strongly the pull of solidarity, the G77, the sense of representing the developing world, the global south, all of which is perfectly understandable. But it meant when you had a resolution on non-proliferation in Iran, or if you had resolutions on Myanmar or Zimbabwe, South Africa was in a position of very much disappointing a number of countries. So I suppose the example you're giving of Israel is one where I might say, there's a real prospect for disappointing people on that also.
Okay, you mentioned climate change, and that's now been debated a couple of times in the Security Council in terms of, is this a security issue? Is this something that should be part of the remit of the Security Council? Andrew, we know that climate change is of a grave importance to our Pacific neighbours, to our very populated and closest neighbour to the north, Indonesia, which has the 4th longest coastline and many folk living on the edge, and of course our neighbours to the west in Africa. So do you think Australia's done enough on climate change to be able to make a contribution to any future security debates, because it's quite likely to come up with increasing frequency?
Well, I think the short answer is no, Australia hasn't done enough on climate change. And I think we know know the arguments, we can rehearse them about not cutting emissions enough, not supporting developing countries enough with adaptation or their own efforts of reducing their emissions. But I think what the raising of the question of climate change raises is, for me, what policy agenda is Australia going to pursue if it manages in October to get the votes, get those 2/3 of the votes. And I think there are some experiences that we could be drawing upon. I think climate change is an interesting one with the role of Germany when during their presidency they hosted a debate, their month-long presidency of the Security Council. They hosted a debate on climate change, which has moved the debate at Security Council level a little bit further in a positive direction. And I think that's an example that we should be really starting to look towards. The important thing about that climate change debate was it started to challenge some of the traditional conceptions of security and about recognising that security is not just about fighting or prevention of fighting. There are other factors which affect human security, and climate change is one of those. I think Australia needs to work out what its agenda will be if it manages to win those 130 odd votes in October. I think moving ahead on climate change is one of those issues. I think trying to pick up some of the stream on protection of civilians is another critical issue. Trying to develop greater momentum around the Arms Trade Treaty for ratification, which is up on the agenda at the moment, is something where Australia, as one of the friends of the chair in the Arms Trade Treaty negotiations, to play a really positive role. But I think one of the disappointing things so far in the discussion about the Security Council bid is there's been not enough focus on what role Australia would play if we actually got onto the Security Council. And I think we should be spending more time thinking through that sort of agenda. If I add one other thing, we should also be thinking about the way we play our role on the Security Council. We should be highlighting a transparent way of operating, transparent both in terms of connection with the Australian public, but Australian civil society and global civil society. So I'd recommend, for instance, things like doing a quarterly report to Parliament about what we've done on the Security Council, holding regular consultations both in New York and elsewhere, and New York and Canberra, with civil society groups. But for us to do some real thinking about the ways in which we operate if we manage to succeed, as well as what should be our clear policy agenda if we manage to get the votes come October.
Well, it remains to be seen then whether the Security Council will see weather of mass destruction as in the same vein as weapons of mass destruction. Okay, it's your turn. We have 2 roving mics. Please use this opportunity to put a question, not make a long comment, and keep your question fairly short and sharp.
Thank you. On Monday night at the Wheeler Centre, there was a public dialogue with Gareth Evans and Alexander Downer, the 2 keynote speakers. The topic was Australian foreign policy and the future, and during the course of that, the candidature for the Security Council was raised. I don't recall which one of the former Prime Ministers said, but they made the point that traditionally the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade had never encouraged seats on the Security Council. They found it too expensive, it took too much time, and it was too difficult. Would you care to comment, if indeed you know, what DFAT's position is on this bid?
Volunteers for that one?
Robyn has the Deputy State Director who might wish to say something.
No, DFAT was nervous. DFAT was hurt badly by the loss in '95, and no one, wants to be associated with another loss. But once they got into the campaign, they were fine. So I don't think. I don't agree that they think it's too much trouble or it's not important. I think the department as a whole appreciates the importance of serving on the Security Council. But it is a high-profile campaign, and when things don't go right, somebody gets blamed.
There is another problem, and that is that in terms of the status of issues, multilateral issues within the department are not at the top. Relations with the US are at the top, and with China and Japan are pretty close to it, and so on. And everyone knows that the mission in New York has to work enormously hard. I mean, they really work extraordinarily hard, as Robert would know better than anyone in the room. And they're understaffed, severely understaffed, and that means that it's very hard to do the job. So for both those reasons, it's not a particularly favoured issue to take up.
Right, a question from this side of the room. Yes, at the very back, looking enthusiastic.
Thank you. I've got a question I'd like to address to the panellists. I'm wondering if you would comment on whether you think Australia's alignment with the United States is going to be a problem in terms of winning enough votes in October. If you're representing a state from, say, Africa, Latin America, or the Middle East, aren't you more likely to vote for a candidate that is perhaps less aligned with the United States than is the case with Australia? That's
Melissa,
not meant to be a Dorothy Dixer for John either.
Well, I'll put this one to Melissa. I mean, does Australia have that much of a perception that, do other states perceive Australia simply as America's deputy sheriff?
There are certainly some states where that would be an accurate characterisation. And so
enough to kill the bid?
That's the difficulty. The best numbers we have from Tom Woodruff, and I do want to recognise his work on this, is that looking at the best guess at the moment of how many we are looking at, it's something like 75 which are either confirmed or pretty likely, and then a group, I think about 35 that we probably don't have much hope on, and then there's rather a lot in between. So what's going to work with that group is a very difficult question.
And with a secret ballot, we'll never know.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So when, for example, we lost last time, I know that Richard Butler talked a lot about it as, what was it, I think, dirty lying scoundrels, the people who said they were going to vote and who didn't. Though in some cases I think we want them to be dirty lying scoundrels. So one of the sad bits of what you might see as a slightly later bid is that some countries which we really should have been able to rely on, like Indonesia, had already declared for the other two candidates. So we're sort of hoping that maybe they might change their mind on the way to the ballot box.
I think we should remember the last major battle that Australia had for trying to win an international election was the World Cup. And we got one vote. I hope we do a little bit better.
Was that alignment with the United
States? Yes.
Okay, one in the middle here.
Thank you so much. What is the added value of Australia's participation in the Security Council, considering that other countries boost the same credentials, for example, Brazil multilateralism, financial contribution to the UN regular budget, Japan and Germany, for example, small island countries and landlocked countries, they can represent themselves. What does Australia offer that these other countries don't offer yet? And my second question, if I can abuse your time, does that mean, does Australia's bid for a seat in the Security Council mean that the country is less committed to UN reform? Thank you so much.
Robert, would you like to answer the added value?
UN reform is usually spoken of in terms of the reforming the Security Council, and there's no doubt that if you were forming a model today, you wouldn't have the model that we now have. You know, why would you have France and not Germany? Why would you have China and not India? Why would you have no state from Africa, no permanent member from Latin America? So it was a historical aspect that's proven very difficult to change, because any change in permanent members means that a permanent member loses some value, and they've got a veto, and they don't tend to vote against their own interests. So we've had to make do with, in today's geopolitical world, with a structure that was designed for a previous world. Having said that, any state can stand, of course, and they stand in regional groupings, and the regional groupings, WEOG is the hardest in many ways, but they stand, most of them are reasonably democratic in the way they make their decisions within the regions, and it's hard for everyone to get a turn, because, as we said, there's only 10 non-permanent members, and there's 193 member states, but you do get a chance. You do get a chance to stand. You do get a chance to garner the 2/3 majority that's necessary to get elected. And a lot of very small states, Burkina Faso, for example, have been able to make their contribution.
Just 2 quick points. One is that clearly Australia contributes more financially than Luxembourg and Finland put together, far, far more. And not only in our dues, but also in voluntary contributions. And secondly, we have always been, or mostly been fairly active in peacekeeping, and in one way in particular at present, we're leading the world, and that is in the provision of police. The number of police in peacekeeping operations is rising faster than of any other group, because most of the places where peace has got to be kept are in civil wars, and what is often required is police who'll help with law and order. And the Australian Federal Police have a very active program of recruitment and training of police. About 800 are part of that program, and a substantial number are serving overseas at present. And the first head of UN Police was an Australian, and he said when lecturing to my class on the UN that we are in fact leading the world in this form of peacekeeping at present, and it's a very important form.
Okay, down here in the front. We'll just wait for the microphone.
And a rather amorphous question, whether Australia matters to the rest of the world, which I accept as a rather amorphous question, but it follows on from reading books by or about people like George Bush Jr., Maggie Thatcher and Chris Patten. And one thing I've noticed common to those books is Australia hardly ever gets mentioned. It just very rarely gets mentioned in book by major world leaders, and it just brings me to the thought that perhaps what we think really just doesn't matter.
Melissa's going to tackle that one.
I am. I think historically you may well be right, and our sense of our own importance may not be reflected in the importance that is placed on us by others. However, I think that what I think we will see in the past as being a charmed period may be coming to an end. There's a real sense at the moment that Australia is becoming a bellwether state, a litmus test state. So when the countries in the region are talking about what they see as the increasing rivalry between the US and China, they look very closely at what Australia is doing. So if you look at something like the decision to have basing of Marines in Darwin, which in many ways is not controversial. It was announced during the 60th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty, so our alliance should not perhaps have been a surprise to anybody, but it still got a real response from the region, that Australia was making things worse, that we were inflaming tensions. And I think we're actually getting attention in some ways that we may not like so much. We may matter a lot more.
Okay, over here. The striped jumper, blue, just in front of you. Hands up there, yes.
Professor Langmore, I think you've probably partially answered my question from another question, but I still like to ask my question. How can Australia specifically contribute to reducing weapons of mass destruction as a representative on the Security Council? And how would we contribute more than Finland or Luxembourg?
Well, fortunately, we were involved in sponsoring the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and Gareth Evans was one of the two chairs of that commission, and it produced an excellent and a quite outstandingly good report, which has been talked about substantially since then, and the government has been supportive of it. And if we were on the Security Council, I think we'd be an advocate for the recommendations of that report. And one of the very good developments in the Security Council since President Obama was elected is that the US has been very active in promoting nuclear disarmament, and he chaired a meeting of the Security Council while it agreed on a resolution which set out a whole program of work on nuclear disarmament, and Australia would be a very active supporter of that program. I think we're well equipped to play a part in that.
Can I just say?
Yeah, sure.
I don't want to I'll be the last person to discount the importance of working on weapons of mass destruction. I've done a lot of work over the years on it, but I think there is a live issue as well as the work that John's outlined around small arms, and which actually kill more people than weapons of mass destruction day in, day out, and particularly in our region. Australia has got a real role to play, has played a very important role in getting the Arms Trade Treaty up, and would have a real role to play at the Security Council around the Arms Trade Treaty and helping develop a momentum for ratification of that treaty. So I think when we're looking at some of the causes of armed conflict, yes, it's really critical that there's work done on weapons of mass destruction, but building that momentum, strengthening great engagement with the Arms Trade Treaty process will be even more vital, and it's something where Australia's got a great track record and got a great interest in, because we can see what the prevalence of small arms, for instance, in Papua New Guinea. The consequences for our domestic policy are going to be pretty great. The consequences for peace and security in our region are very great here and now.
Okay. Yes, just here with the white shirt. Oh, actually, you both got white shirts, so you both get a go. Starting with the gentleman with the glasses. Actually, both got glasses.
Okay.
With the grey hair.
That's very hard.
Melissa, you've done a lot of interesting work around the area of citizen diplomacy, and I'd like to ask you and the panel the question whether Australia could have made greater use of its own diaspora in its bid for the UN Security Council, and also of its multicultural population that we have here that could be used as an asset, if you like, as a bridge to linking with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Auden. I mean, I think it's a great question. And just to give people a sense of what we mean by citizen diplomacy, if you think of traditional diplomacy, it was essentially just government to government, of state to state. Public diplomacy broadens that out, and that says it's talking to the foreign publics to try to give them a good impression of your country. Citizen diplomacy is about ordinary citizens of different countries interacting and therefore getting a real view of each other. And it's a vitally important part of the way the countries are seen by other countries. I would say generally that Australia's public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy is underutilised for all sorts of reasons. And I can do nothing but echo John's fantastic comments on the long-term disastrous underfunding of our important national asset of our diplomatic service. I look, say, at the US, which you always see as our comparison. Their public diplomacy section is bigger than our whole foreign service. And at the moment, our public diplomacy section is again being squeezed and squeezed again. So I couldn't agree more. I think what's really positive about the citizen diplomacy side is that, thank God, we don't need more money for it, because there really isn't more money for the Department of Foreign Affairs at the moment, which is a disaster, but that's how it is. Citizen diplomacy I think, is really saying there's resources out there already. There are diasporas all around the world. There are usually around 1 million Australians working or studying overseas. There's people who are friendly to Australia, who come here to study, and our whole international education industry. How does that help us? Those, I think, are really precious resources. And the question is, how do we link those in better? That's happening already, but how do we mobilise it in order to really help with things like the Security Council bid and our national interests more broadly?
We're certainly working on that here at Melbourne. The next gentleman.
I was quite interested by the mentioning quite early in the session, saying that as a political institution, which I assume is reflecting global power distribution, but there was kind of an assumption that the vote is unlikely to be fair. I found that a very interesting observation. But in a practical sense, do you think that there are any reforms that are likely to happen in the next couple of decades in the way that these sorts of decisions and also just the UN Security Council occurs that would be able to make this institution fairer at a global level?
Robert, would you like to?
Well, I think it's a bit depressing, but Security Council reform is, I think, in its 19th year of debate. So you say in the next 2 decades? Well, maybe, but I wouldn't wait to see. I think it's better at the moment to make the existing system work as well as possible. But when you say that the vote is not fair, I don't quite know what that means either. Each nation state will vote in what they perceive as their interests, and they will assess that on a range of different in a range of different ways. Some may be thinking of an aid relationship. Some may be thinking of an alliance issue. Some may be thinking of a historical voting pattern on Israel. But just because they vote on one or more of those particular aspects doesn't, to me, mean that it's unfair. Or even if they group together and vote, because, say, the countries in the Caribbean have endorsed us. Is that fair? Well, I think it's fair, but somebody might say, well, how dare they vote as a group? You can't actually be sure that they will vote as a group because it's a secret ballot. But I don't see that as unfair.
Any other responses to that question?
No, I strongly agree with Robert on that. I think every state has a vote, and it's not tied up beforehand. There are alliances, of course, that influence what the outcome will be, but that's not unfair. That's just the nature of interstate relations. And I thought
the judgment on South Africa, and that was a commonly held judgment, was a bit tough as well. Often, if the country doesn't vote the way you think it should vote, you say, obviously not doing the job well. South Africa did put a different perspective on a number of issues, and it surprised a number of parties, including other African states. But it doesn't mean they're not entitled to put a different perspective, and I don't think it means that they therefore perform badly. I think they lacked resources, and it's it's quite an uncomfortable environment within Africa, because you've got 53 states, and what has North Africa, the Arab states, got in common with Southern Africa or West Africa, and they're often in quite an awkward voting situation. But I think they did their best, and well done to them.
Well, and I should respond on that. I certainly wasn't saying I thought South Africa didn't perform well. I was talking about the expectations that were placed on it.
The expectations were they would vote more often our way.
Exactly, that's happened. And I probably should respond a little, because I did mention the word fair, so I did bring that up, Ghazi. I think what I was saying is that it's a political process, and as our two former politicians here on the panel would say, that is not fair or unfair, it's just political. That's what it is. But what I'm saying is it's more like a beauty pageant than a selection panel. There aren't a set of criteria and everyone gets ranked by them and the absolute best according to those criteria win. It's a political contest. And as you say, states vote according to who they think will do the job best according to their perception.
And thank goodness for that.
And And many say the UN General Assembly is certainly better than the Bretton Woods institutions, which is $1, one vote, not one country, one vote. Okay. Yes, in the middle there.
This just relates earlier to, I guess, the timing of the vote, and you mentioned that there's perhaps not as much bipartisan support for the bid as would be necessary. Given the current polls, it's very likely that there could be a change in government during the time between the vote, if Australia was successful, and the time that we'd actually serve on the Security Council. So I guess a two-pronged question would be, do you think the rest of the United Nations would be taking this likelihood into account when casting their vote? And if there was a change in government, what impact, if any, do you think this would have on the role that Australia would play on the Security Council?
Well, when there's a negative story of disunity in the Australian press, mysteriously it gets circulated around member states. So there are at least some parties who think it could be an influence. And they certainly do. They do ask that question. You know, if you're elected, would a different incoming government be as enthusiastically supportive of the role as the current government? And to give credit to our diplomats, they will give an answer like they have no reason to believe otherwise. You know, historically, the coalition has been a very strong supporter of the institution as well.
We're just about out of time, so I'm going to give each of the panellists just one last little 30-second grab to say what else they think Australia could do in the next 6 months to improve its chance for a bid. And if you don't like that, you can say whatever you want. So I'll start with you, Melissa.
30 seconds. I'll say what we shouldn't do. Canada lost last year, as we've talked about, to Germany and Portugal. So we know that sending gifts of maple syrup don't work. We know that having a Mountie in uniform for photo ops next to the ballot box doesn't work. So we have to think about some other things. In Canada's case, the lack of bipartisan support was an issue. The day after they lost, the Minister for Foreign Affairs was accusing it of all being Michael Ignatieff's fault that he hadn't supported the bid. So certainly in Luxembourg's and Finland's negative campaigning, they do talk about that uncertainty. To be fair to the opposition, they are not at any point saying that they're against the Security Council seat. They're talking about issues of timing and cost. So they're actually it's quite a nuanced response. However, it's been used as if it was a sort of blanket opposition. I think the thing that has been most effective so far, from what I've heard, has been a trip that was arranged bringing dozens of the permanent representatives to the UN to Australia to wander around and see what Australia was like. And apparently they went on walking tours in central Sydney, they met up with lots of people, and the feedback was that they were really surprised that their vision of Australia and what they thought Australia was about was not reflected in what they saw around them. I think they thought we were much more multicultural, much more modern, much more interesting, I suspect, than they had previously thought, and it really changed their perceptions. So I'd be suggesting things like that are the sort that really have had some effect.
Andrew?
Well, there's an old saying about war is the way that Americans learn about geography. Maybe the Security Council bid is the way that Australians will learn about the world. I found it yesterday I was at lunch with the Parliamentary Secretary, and he's off to Albania, San Marino and Dora, all of which are swinging votes apparently. So Australia is developing relations there. So I think obviously that targeting the countries which are still up for grabs is part of it. I think being clear about mobilising the diaspora, the Australian connections and some of the multicultural connections, I think is really critical. But I'd also say the other sub-theme or sub-slogan of Australia's bid is something along the lines of "we do what we say." I think May the 8th is the federal budget. I hope that the aid budget does not get cut and the increases are actually delivered upon, which is a pretty critical issue. If on May the 8th Australia doesn't deliver on what's in its own budget forward estimates, that's saying something that we don't deliver on what we say we're going to do, and would rebound. I don't want to overstate its importance, but it's not that symbolic importance. So continue to deliver on what we say we are going to do, and back up the slogan that we have used in our campaign bid.
Robert.
Yeah, I think the campaign is going well, and the main thing in these last few months is to remain honest to ourselves. If we there's a series of quite tricky votes coming up in the General Assembly before this vote. If it looks as if we're sort of remodelling ourselves for a short-term cynical benefit, I think we will be voted down on that issue. Mightn't affect the ultimate result, but it wouldn't be in our interest. So don't pretend what we're not. And it is true, I think, that we talked a bit about the greater investment that's been made in Africa, particularly in scholarships and the like, since the campaign was announced, and a signal that wasn't really, that there isn't a long-term commitment behind that would certainly be perceived negatively. So just got to stick with where we are, I think, and be true.
Thank you. John, last word.
I would only add one additional point, because I agreed with all those that were already made, and that is that each of us can make a difference. If you think that the Security Council matters, and you must think that because it's about peace and security, then each of us can do something about that. We can write to our Member of Parliament, or we can organise discussions about what Australia should do if it's elected. We can take part in functions like this. It's one of those areas where lots of people feel disempowered, but we're only disempowered if we decide to be disempowered. We can make some difference if we write to the papers or talk to friends about it even. So I'd urge everyone to if you're persuaded, take some action, because that will help influence Australian opinion, and that will help influence the government to be more fully active in its campaign.
Well, thank you, John. Well, that so concludes the formal part of the evening, but there's more. It's an informal part. It's drinks and nibbles, which is just upstairs in the Arts Hall. So if you go out that door or that door and head in this direction and up the stairs, you'll find it. So without any further ado, I'd like you to join me in thanking our speakers for this evening.